Hey, welcome back to the Dionysus Circle podcast. Today we're joined by theologian Andreas Bergman, who earned his doctorate from the University of Helsinki and recently published an article on the new perspective on Paul and St. Maximus the Confessor. So we discuss his article in this episode. Enjoy the conversation.
I was born and grew up in Finland, which is, of course, a secular but traditional Lutheran country, and was born into a nominal Christian family. I was a teenager when I experienced some sort of a religious conversion to Lutheranism, and I got very interested in learning more about the faith. So I started studying 16th century Lutheran sources, and I found this theologian called Martin Chemnitz, and actually I've devoted most of my academic career to Chemnitz. And this Martin Chemnitz is probably, at least is one of the greatest patristic scholars of the 16th century. And his aim is to prove that the Lutherans are like the true heirs of the ancient church, and that the Tridentine Catholicism had departed from this patristic faith. And he uses a lot of patristic quote text and patristic material in his works in order to refute Catholicism. And through Chemnitz, I encountered church fathers. I got really interested in studying their works. I started buying some English translations of patristic writings, and one of them was this small collection of Maximus the Confessor's of excerpts from Maximus the Confessor's works called "On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ." Uh, and as the strict confessional Lutheran, I was maybe 20 years old. I tried to understand Maximus, but I couldn't understand the word. Then 7 years ago, I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and maybe a few years after that, I got the idea that, hey, maybe I should try to read Maximus again and see if I can now understand him better. And this led me to academic study of Maximus. So I would say that I'm foremost, because of my background, I'm a Reformation or late Reformation scholar, but I often say that patristics is a hobby of mine. And in this article that you mentioned, I think I try to combine these two interests of mine, like Reformation theology in the sense that Reformation centers around the question of justification, and then patristic through Maximus the Confessor.
Would you say that Maximus was important in the conversion process to Eastern Orthodoxy, or was something else, another thinker, maybe more?
Not Maximus really wasn't. I think it was more like some lives of some Orthodox saints who really impressed me.
Great. Yeah. So now turning to your article, could you maybe tell us about the two schools of Pauline interpretation? On the one hand, we have the new perspective on Paul. On the other hand, we have the old perspective on Paul. What defines each of these schools?
Okay, so maybe I should say first that it is sometimes questioned that whether there is such a movement as the new perspective on Paul, because so many different kind of thinkers are categorized under this one movement or school of thought. Nevertheless, I think there are some broad themes that these uh, exegetes um, share in common. One fundamental presupposition of the writings is that the Apostle Paul can understood correctly only as a first century Jew. And then these theologians of the New Perspective argue that the Protestant reformers and the so-called Old Perspective on Paul has misunderstood Paul because they have read him through these 16th century presuppositions and anxieties and worries or questions. And then there are this number of or several issues which are connected to this misreading of Paul, and one of them is this question of the works of the law. That what do they actually mean in the original Pauline context?
Just real quick to summarize, though, we have in Romans 3 the famous saying, for we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. And then also you have a similar kind of statement in Galatians. And so it's pretty clear from that justification, being declared righteous by God, works of the law, whatever that is, has no role in achieving justification. But then it's like the question becomes, well, what do we mean by works of the law? And that's kind of what divides the two perspectives, right? Is answering the question of what is Paul referring to when he says, you know, works of the law do not play a role in achieving justification.
That is all correct. And the old perspective on Paul, the central claim of this school is that when Paul excludes these works of the law from justification, he intends to say that human works, like any works conceivable, have no role to play in justification, which they understand as this kind of a, well, forgiveness of sins, this kind of a imputation of righteousness of Christ to a believer, is this kind of a divine transaction where we receive this kind of a foreign righteousness from Christ, which is imputed to us solely through faith. But then the new perspective on Paul does not conceive the works of the law similarly. They argue that the works of the law refer primarily to certain precepts of the Mosaic law, the Torah, like circumcision, um, keeping the Sabbath, some dietary laws. And when Paul excludes works of the law from justification, he intends to say that a pagan or a Gentile convert to Christianity does not have to or need not become a Jew before he can become a Christian. So there are no the Gentile convert is not obliged to follow Jewish ritual law or the Torah more broadly, and this is the crucial difference. I think Matthew, and I think we go to Matthew J. Thomas at some point, but he makes a helpful. He puts it this quite helpfully when he says that the old perspective tends to stress like works of the law, and then the new perspective says like works of the law. So the difference is on the emphasis. So for old perspective, works are a problem in the context of the justification. For the new perspective, it's the Mosaic law that's the problem if that is required from the Gentile believers.
So yeah, just to review, it's like the new perspective wants to say works of the law is referring to maybe something a little bit more narrow, which is these Mosaic boundary markers of Jewish identity. So maybe, like you said, the Abrahamic sign of the covenant, circumcision, the dietary laws that come in the Mosaic context, the Sabbath observance, those various things. Um, when Paul excludes works of the law from justification, for the new perspective, he's excluding boundary markers. That these boundary markers of Jewish identity are not necessary, not sufficient for achieving a right standing with God. And then it seems like the old perspective, which I guess, one would just associate with like classical Protestantism, right? Um, the old perspective is going to have these works of the law refer much more broadly to, yeah, like you said, like any work, any human effort to earn righteousness. Um, I mean, so I guess like one quick just clarification question. I'm kind of curious, like, um, for some people who aren't familiar with this issue, they might be surprised to hear about the old perspective because, like, you know, um, it just seems like some kind of works is going to be a dimension of Christian life. True faith is going to be presumably, include charity and other sort of types of activities. So, could you just, would you mind commenting on that? Like, the old perspective does still include works, I guess, but it's more like it's not the ground, right? Isn't this the way they put it? It's not the ground of your justification. It's just sort of evidence of your justification. Is that the right way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. So the theologians of the old perspective are very strict on this matter that works must be excluded from justification, and justification, the issue of justification concerns the what are the grounds of the relationship between man, a human being, and God. And but then they do, I think, well, historically at least, all Protestant theologians have believed that this justification is followed by a life of renewal by the Spirit. So when one is justified, when one's relationship to God has been reestablished, or there's this gracious relationship between a Christian and God, then and a Christian necessarily becomes a partaker of the Holy Spirit, and this Holy Spirit affects this renewal, which results in fruits of the Spirit, which are good fruits. If one does not have good works, it's evidence that one does not have true faith. So the works are there, but they're a consequence of this justification. But for the Protestant reformers, it was very important to exclude works from this the doctrine of justification, because they had this pastoral concern that if works are there, a part of justification, then a Christian can never be certain of their salvation. And this was the key issue of the Reformation, at least the Lutheran
Okay.
Reformation.
So, okay, interesting. So you would say the primary motivation for excluding works from the ground of justification is the worry about assurance.
Yeah.
How can you really have assurance if works are included in the ground of justification?
And then the theologians of the New Perspective on Paul claim that okay, that was completely a foreign idea to Apostle Paul, that there's no indication of any worry about certainty of salvation in his writings. So the 16th century Lutherans read this concern back to Paul's writings, and that's the way how this Protestant interpretation of Paul like was found.
Interesting. I mean, there are biblical passages which I don't recall right now where Paul expresses some kind of what appears to be some kind of assurance. And so it's not as though the assurance issue is entirely um, unmotivated. I mean, would you would agree with that, right? Like it's anyway. I mean, I just I don't know, just pointing out that like there is an element of like you can find these like passages in Paul where he says things that like seem to express a kind of assurance, at least seemingly.
But I think the difference is, at least I actually did my doctoral dissertation on certainty of salvation in Martin Chemnitz, and for him, the crucial difference between his position, the Catholic position, is that the Catholics do allow some sort of a certitude of hope, that one can have this hope and deep hope that one will be saved. But for Chemnitz, that is not enough. For him, certainty is more like this kind of indubitable assurance that one will be saved. And then, of course, the question is that does Apostle Paul, when Apostle Paul talks about assurance in some places, to what kind of assurance does he refer to?
Great. Okay, so let's now talk a little bit about the more recent work of Matthew J. Thomas that you engage in your article. And then, we're kind of inching closer toward your thesis here. We're kind of just still setting the ground here. I hope it's useful for the listeners. But let's getting closer to your thesis, which obviously has to do with Maximus the Confessor. Could you first tell us a little bit about the recent work of Matthew J. Thomas? It seems like he's made an important contribution to the debate between the old and the new perspective on Paul.
Yeah, so Matthew J. Thomas is a theologian who has expertise in early reception of the Pauline doctrine of justification. And his great contribution to this debate is this. I have a paperback version of his book. I think this is from 2020. I cannot remember when the hardback came out, but his book is called Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception. So he studies how the second century church fathers understood the Pauline term works of the law. And Thomas argues that if we compare their position to this contemporary discussion on Pauline interpretation, they come much closer to the new perspective on Paul than the old perspective. And he reaches this conclusion by posing three questions to these early Christian sources. First is, what are the works of the law? Second is, what is their purpose? And third is, why are Christians not obliged to observe them? And Thomas justifies this his focus on the second century by claiming that reception history has real value in interpretation of historical sources. During the second century, he argues there was still a living memory of the apostles and their teaching, and therefore the witness of the second century fathers can help us better understand Paul in the first century context.
Yeah, so the kind of figures he's dealing with, I guess, are like, what are they? They're going to be like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Ignatius of Antioch.
Yep.
Some of those.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Didache. Then
okay, the Didache.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And so the idea is that actually, if you look into this, the second century the second century Christian context, the figures are actually closer to the new perspective rather than the old perspective. Now, I'm just curious. Like you mentioned, so this is kind of going against the person that you studied, or your kind of primary expertise, Martin Chemnitz, right? Because you were just saying Martin Chemnitz was held that the patristic sources were in line with the classical Reformation position, whereas it seems like Matthew J. Thomas is going in the opposite direction as Chemnitz. Would that be correct?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, interesting. Now, just to be clear, like one thing that I guess that this is important, a reason this is important, because it's like there's a whole accuracy debate about the new versus old perspective. It's like, who is actually accurately describing Paul? And if the second century patristic authors are in line with the new perspective, that obviously doesn't prove that the new perspective is more accurate to Paul, but it does provide some probabilistic evidence, because it would be surprising. It would be surprising if Paul was actually an old perspective, and then really quickly in the second century we slide into the new perspective. So point being that the work of Thomas would seem to suggest that the new perspective is more accurate. Is that kind of important? Would you say that's like kind of the stakes?
I think so. So there is no knockdown argument against the old perspective, but we can make this probabilistic case against, or relying on the second century fathers. It looks much more credible that the new perspective on Paul is onto something. Yeah. No, actually, Thomas has, I think it was maybe a few years ago, he published in the St. Andrews Encyclopedia of Theology. It's freely available. An entry on justification, and he goes through the history of justification, starting from the early fathers. And so this work that we are currently discussing, it centers around the term works of the law. But that entry in the St. Andrews Encyclopedia, it's a more broader entry, and I think it's quite interesting. There he argues that the early fathers believed that man is initially justified through faith and by grace. But then the Christian life after that, it's like a synergistic process, and we have our contribution to make there. And that is against at least some forms of the old perspective too, because at least like the Lutheran perspective, which is very monergistic, because it emphasizes that salvation is completely dependent on God, and there is no synergistic process, but it's solely in God's hands.
There in the encyclopedia article, it seems like Thomas is holding that when it comes to the question of how we appropriate righteousness, it's just faith, but maybe the justification is more of like an ongoing process rather than a moment, or like maybe is he kind of suggesting that the justification is this like longer process which is initiated by sola fide, by faith alone, but works enter in to the later stages of this longer process of justification? Is that kind of the theory then?
Well, I haven't read the articles in a year, so I should read it again. But if I remember correctly, I think he argues that there's initial justification baptism. So God gives His grace in baptism freely without any of our works. And of course we confess our faith when we're baptized, and so that happens by faith. But then there is this process of justification where we grow in the um, in justice, or I don't remember exactly how he puts it, but basically it's both like a momentaneous thing in baptism, but then there's a process following it, and there is not strict separation between a justification and sanctification, or justification and renewal, like there is in the Protestant understanding of justification.
Okay, great. Yeah, because right in the Protestant understanding, the justification is sort of a decisive, once and for all, instantaneous moment, whereas maybe sanctification would be like once you're planted in God's garden, that growing into the fruits of righteous works, like that's like a more ongoing process. And
Yeah, I think that's the most common way of putting it. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So, so much for preliminaries. Let's now kind of get closer to, yeah, really your article, which is you're focusing on Maximus the Confessor, and who obviously lived centuries after Paul. So, yeah. So, what can you just tell us what motivated you to look at Maximus the Confessor? Why is looking at his doctrine of justification worthwhile?
Yeah, but well, first there is this personal interest of mine, which is due to my background in Lutheranism, and also, well, I also already told that I encountered this book from Maximus and was intrigued by it. So I was thinking, okay, no one has ever studied, at least to my knowledge, has ever studied Maximus' doctrine of justification. And I have studied the issue of justification quite a lot. So why wouldn't there would be a nice thing to do to combine this my knowledge of this doctrine with Maximus and see what I found out. And of course, I thought also that Maximus is perhaps the greatest Byzantine theologian. I think he's he's a representative of the Eastern tradition at his best. So I don't know how it's elsewhere, but well, I think it's quite common phenomenon in 20th century Orthodoxy to paint this simplistic picture that we have the rationalistic West and then we have the mystical East, and the West is juridical, is soteriology, and the East is therapeutic. And then at least in Finland, I have maybe some lay people or maybe some priests to say that the Orthodox Church has no doctrine of justification. And I think this is quite problematic because it seems like Paul cared about the question of justification. So I was interested to find out that if we take like a great representative of the Eastern tradition and see what let's take a great representative of the Eastern tradition and see what he thinks about this doctrine. And but well, then I also think that as I studied Maximus, I thought that hey, this is an interesting figure to study because it seems like it's too much to say that he's a bridge figure between these two camps, like the new perspective and the old perspective. But he has some commonalities with the old perspective that the earlier patristic writers do not have, at least according to my reading. And I think that makes him maybe a ecumenically promising figure because, for example, Maximus, well, we probably go to this later on, but it seems like there is at least the possibility that in Maximus' thought, all works are excluded from justification in certain sense. So it's not about only the boundary markers. And in this respect, he is closer to the old perspective, if Thomas' interpretation of the earlier sources is accurate one.
Yeah, just to echo that point, it's like you're going to argue that, so if we think of the new perspective as having a fairly narrow understanding of what works of the law refers to, narrow in the sense of it's just referring to these boundary marker stuff like circumcision, dietary laws, etc. Maximus is actually closer to the old perspective than that, insofar as his the way he understands works of the law is not just going to include the ethnic boundary markers. In other words, when Maximus is thinking about what is excluded from being the ground of justification, he's going to say it's not simply the boundary marker works of the law. There's something more broad going on. It has to do with, I guess, our inner disposition in the way that we execute, the moral life potentially. I mean, obviously, I'll let you describe what he wants to exclude. But yeah, do you want to maybe just preview for the listeners just really quick? I mean, obviously, we're going to dive into it further, but like, could you kind of give the really first quick gloss on what Maximus understands by works of the law?
Yeah, well, maybe I could say first that regarding the new perspective on Paul, that it is true that often the works of the law are identified with the boundary marking precepts, but then there are some theologians of the new perspective who say that it's not just the boundary markers, but the whole Torah, the Mosaic law. But of course, the boundary markers stand at the heart of the controversy because those certain precepts like they were at the heart of the Jewish identity, and that's why they are central of the controversy. But when it comes to Maximus, Maximus' perspective, I think it's shaped by his ascetical theology, and there the point is that all works are just means of growing spiritually, of purifying the soul, and of increasing the knowledge of God. So, and basically, if one treats works as something more, like that we're devoted to doing works as works, that there is this no intention of, or no motivation of them serving as means of growing knowledge of God, then they are like this. They can hinder spiritual growth and be obstacles of grace in a Christian. And of course, well, we can say that. Well, I'm not sure if I say too much at this point, but of course, some like circumcision could be a prime example of like a work of the law that is a hindrance to faith if it's not seen spiritually, or if it's not understood as this divine ordinance, which is meant for growth in faith, and not of some sort of observance that need to be followed for its own sake.
Yeah, based on reading your article, my impression was like for Maximus, there is going to be an element of observance, which is part of your justification. However, if that observance has the wrong motivation, like you said, if it's not for the sake of growing in knowledge of God, growing closer to God, I suppose. But then maybe he also includes fear of God. At any rate, if it doesn't have the right motivation, your observance, then that is not going to contribute to your justification with God. But yeah, let's maybe dive in a little bit more into the details of your analysis of Maximus. So maybe we'll just step back really quick and mention, recall the three questions that Matthew J. Thomas offers. So basically, Matthew J. Thomas in his work, he kind of comes up with three questions that are kind of key to any theory of justification. The first question is the kind of what you could call the reference question, which is to what works does the phrase works of the law in Paul refer to? what is Paul referring to when he talks about works of the law? But then there's also like a kind of a purpose question, which is what is the purpose of the works of the law? What was their, why did God institute the law? What's the purpose of performing them? All that. And then there's kind of this like Christian question, which is why are these works, whatever they are, no longer necessary for Christians? And so those are kind of the three basic questions. And in your article, it's really awesome. Like you kind of pose each of these three questions to Maximus, and you see how he answers them. And so, kind of to approach the reference question, which is, to what works do the works of law refer? Can you tell us to approach that? Can you just first tell us about the three kinds of law in Maximus, and then just why is it helpful for understanding his doctrine of justification?
Yeah. So as you said, I treat these three kinds of law, and my for the simple reason that I thought that if I want to find out what the works of the law are, I first need to understand what Maximus means by the law. And in Maximus' works, there is often this distinction between these three kinds of law, which are natural law, the written law, and the law of grace, which Maximus equates with the spiritual law. Well, the natural law refers to divine intentionality embedded in creation, and it is grounded in Maximus' doctrine of the logoi, or logi, which are divine principles according to which all created realities have been made. So the logoi, they distinguish created beings from one another and define their proper ends. For example, because human beings are rational beings, conformity to our natural logos involves living according to reason. And now for those who have spiritual insight, for those who have the eyes to see, to look the creation properly, they can basically read the divine will in creation by looking at the created beings and see what's natural to them. So these are the natural law. Then the written law expresses exactly the same divine will as natural law, but in a more accessible manner, in a codified form. So it makes the divine will clearer and more explicit. And then in addition, it adds to these divine commandments threats of punishments or penalties, which urge those who are under the law to fulfill the precepts of the law. And then the law of grace, which Maximus equates with the spiritual law, it is most fully revealed in the incarnate Christ, who is like the law become incarnate. And whereas Maximus' treatment of the natural law and the written law tend to emphasize outward obedience to them, the law of grace focuses on inward fulfillment. So it's not only about outward actions, but also these inner acts of the soul, transformation of the heart, and proper inner motivation to follow God. And although then Maximus distinguishes these three laws, he sees them profoundly intertwined. And it can be a bit misleading that Maximus speaks about natural law and law of grace, because in the Western tradition there is this tendency to juxtapose nature and grace. But in Maximus, the two are often, they are distinguishable, but still like inseparable. And I believe this is because it is the incarnate Christ who is the both the beginning and end of creation. So when man was created, Christ was like the example or the blueprint or the archetype of Adam. So and our human beings are called to conform their lives to the incarnate Christ, who is the fulfillment of human nature, and also that fulfillment is beyond our capacities, because humanity has been deified in Christ. And in this way, I think the natural and the grace are always together in Maximus, because, well, Christ is the most fully human being there is, but he's also a deified. His humanity has been deified, and we are called to that deified humanity. So that's why there is no like this strict nature grace juxtaposition in Maximus. But if we think about the relevance of this whole discussion for Maximus' understanding of justification, I think it's first of all that the law is good. It's about Christ. So the law is not the enemy or this. And there's in Maximus, in Protestant theology, law is often the primary function of the law is to accuse human beings of their sins so that they would understand their need for forgiveness of sins. But in Maximus, the perspective is totally different. That it's this law is grace in itself, and we are called to conform ourselves to law, and we become truly human when we conform what is natural to us, and that is the task of the Christian life. So there is this, when our perspective juxtaposes human effort and divine grace, this is completely foreign to Maximus. These two go together like beautifully.
Fascinating. Yeah. So, yeah, just to echo that, like, one theory of the relation between law and grace is that, yeah, they're standing in this like contrast where the law demands you to do something, and if you fulfill it, you live. If you fail to fulfill it, you die, as in Ezekiel 18. Whereas grace is freeing you, I guess, from having to observe the law in order to live. Instead, you can achieve life. You can live by just trusting in God, as in Romans 6. So that's where you kind of set up that would be like a kind of like strong contrast between the two. But you're saying there's a way in which, for Maximus, Christ represents a kind of way of synthesizing those two sides, so that they're not in opposition.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yeah. And in Maximus studies, there's been this great discussion about the relationship between nature and grace in Maximus, because there's also this. Well, it's not popular anymore. I don't think so, but it used to be popular. This kind of Thomistic interpretation of Maximus, where there is this sharp distinction between nature and grace. But in the most recent Maximus studies, I think there's emphasis that one could say that the natural end of human beings is supernatural, which probably makes no sense in this kind of a Thomistic or more strictly Aristotelian framework. But I think the incarnate Christ is the key to Maximus' solution in this issue.
Interesting. Okay. I don't know if we want to go too much into this, but like, one thing that puzzled me is like to say that. So, like you said, Maximus, we have these three kinds of law. We have the law of nature, the written law, the law of grace. And I think you were saying that like the law of nature and the written law were in some sense the same. And, that to me was just kind of puzzling, because it's like, okay, there are different categories of law in the Old Testament, in the Torah, so it's like you have the moral law. And I feel like the moral law, when you think about, let's say, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, I could see that being understood in terms of laws of nature. In other words, I can understand thinking that, you shall not commit adultery is somehow in correspondence with the natural logi or logoi that Maximus talks about. But other parts of the written law are, like, I don't know, like the ceremonial laws, of course. So that's going to have to do with like the sacrificial system. like having, doing burnt offerings, whole animal offerings, or like the grain offerings. It also, has to do with like the food laws, the detailed list of clean versus unclean animals. At any rate, all these ceremonial laws, I was having trouble thinking of those as being connected to the natural law. Like I would have normally thought, okay, yeah, some parts of the Old Testament written law for sure seem to plausibly match the natural law, specifically like the Decalogue. But there seems to be other parts of the Old Testament law, such as the ceremonial laws as well as the civil laws related to like. Anyway, um, so I don't know. Do you kind of see what I'm getting? I don't know. Do you have any comments on that whole question?
Yeah, this is one issue that I should have clarified more in the article. I think, well, Maximus like explicitly says, I think, that the substance of the two laws is the same. So fine, so it's there. But how I see it is that if you understand the written law, which Maximus equates to the Mosaic law, I think at least usually, if you understand that law according to the letter, like according that you just take them as this outward ordinances or what you have like actually you must do, then of course the Mosaic law contains like commandments which are not found in the natural law. But I think how Maximus can still claim that the content of the law is the same is that he looks at the Mosaic law with this like spiritually, that there's not only this literal understanding of the commandments but also spiritual understanding. And when Maximus reads these Old Testament writings, he sees these kind of often there's ascetical teachings in these various ordinances of the Mosaic law. So, for example, circumcision. I wonder if I have the quote somewhere, but he claims that circumcision, spiritually understood, refers to that you must cut away the impassionate, the passions of your soul, which are against nature. And that is taught by nature as well. So humans are rational animals, so we must, the divine will is that will subject these lower passions to the rule of reason. So then the commandment to circumcise expresses the same truth in this ritualistic form. So I think that's the key.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Just to bring up the quote you were mentioning. So this is from your article. So this is from Ad Thalassium. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that right? Okay. So from the localized position of the circumcised part, we are taught to undertake voluntarily the circumcision of the impassioned disposition of the soul. Uh, um, and so, yeah, he starts talking about mystical circumcision is the complete removal of the intellect's impassioned relation to the mode of generation that was subsequently added to it. So, okay, so the idea is that it's like at the level of like once you're thinking when you contemplate even the ceremonial law and you have like a more mystical insight into the ceremonial law, such as the purity law, such as the I don't know, maybe even the festival calendar, maybe the temple rites and all that. If you contemplate those properly, you'll see how they have a virtue forming teaching function. And when you see that their function, their purpose is virtue forming, and virtue is an element of like the natural law, then you see how they are like substantially at the level of substance. I don't know, at the deepest level, they're actually one. Is that maybe a correct gloss of?
Yeah, you put it well there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. I mean, I think probably there are people who would push back against the idea that he has this really cool husband theory where it's like each the different laws that you have in the Old Testament, like the law in paradise, the law given after the fall, the laws given at the time of Noah, the Abrahamic circumcision, and so forth. He has this really cool theory that each of these is like a husband to human nature, which was there to like help us become more virtuous.
Hmm.
And obviously, there's going to be people who want to push back against thinking of these as like all for the sake of virtue. I imagine some people might want to interpret them as more like, oh, some of these are really more like boundary marking type of things, ways of conveying that you're part of God's covenantal people. But we don't necessarily have to dive into all that right now. I'm just marking that for the listener. There's going to be people who don't necessarily agree right with like interpreting um, these various written laws as always for the sake of virtue. Would that be correct? Like that's not going to be universally
Yeah, I'm sure about
accepted
that.
necessarily. Yeah. As is everything, right? No, what is universally accepted? Anyway, yeah, not that's not a point against Maximus. Just wanted to flag that for the listener. Anyway, but maybe let's talk about faith a little bit. I feel like that would be cool to just touch on, just like really quickly. It seems like for Maximus, obedience is going to be part of the substance, the ground of salvation. It seems like faith must be fulfilled by the practice of God's commandments. And so that's going to contrast with the old perspective, right? Like, just to be clear.
Yeah. Faith is right. Yeah, there's no juxtaposition between faith and works. Those two go together. Of course, I wonder if this is a good place to mention this, but when Maximus speaks about the correct motivations of good works, he thinks there are three proper motivations to do good. First is the fear of God, second is the hope of reward, and third is the love of God. And I've just been thinking that all these relate to Christ in some sense. If you fear God, there's the judgment of Christ. Christ will be the judge, and also the same as in case of the reward. So all these motivations presuppose faith in some sense, that you believe that the judgment will come,
Right.
and
Right.
Christ
Right.
will
Yeah. You
reward or
can't.
punish you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you act according to your faith.
Yeah. So, right. Like, yeah. So we have three. So is that part of the spiritual law? So it's like the spiritual law sets up maybe that you do need to observe. So for Maximus, to be in a state of grace, I guess you could say, to be, I don't know if this is the same as being declared righteous, but like to be deemed righteous by God, there is an element of obedience, but there's also this other element of the correct inner disposition, which is what you're talking about right there. And like you said, there are kind of three spiritual motives that are considered correct, the correct inner disposition. One, fear of divine punishment. Two, hope of eternal reward. Three, love of God. And what you're pointing out there is that in each of those correct motives, in each of those correct inner dispositions, there is an element of faith, of belief in Christ. Because even with fear of divine punishment, you have, I suppose obviously, obviously, a Jewish person can also have fear of divine punishment without believing in Christ, but from the Christian standpoint, divine punishment is executed by Christ. So when you fear divine punishment, you are fearing something connected to Christ. Anyway, is that kind of, am I echoing correctly?
Yep.
Great. So I don't know. I'm just trying to think, like, because this is obviously going against the old perspective, and I'm just trying to think what kind of objections they would raise, because it's just fun to think about objections. And so Do you feel like the main worry someone of the old perspective would have with this type of theory is that, like, um, if would it, I'm just trying to imagine. I feel like maybe the old perspective, they would be like, oh, how could you ever really know that you've purified your intellect? How can you ever really know that your motivations are right? And if you can't really know that you have the proper spiritual motivation, um, you're always going to be uncertain of your status before God. Um, anyway, I guess, yeah. So it goes back to assurance. Like, they might be. Do you think that the old perspective would hear about Maximus and they would say, okay, um, this is going to undermine that sense of assurance?
I think the great problem would be, or let's say, at least Chemnitz has this presupposition that God demands perfect righteousness from us, and our deeds must be perfect in order to please Him. So, if my motivations are somehow lacking or impure, then they are not pleasing to God, unless, well, this image, I'm not sure if this is a good image, but like if they are filtered through Christ, because there's this idea that Christ has this perfect righteousness, and when you have faith in Christ, God sees you through Christ, and then all the imperfections of your deeds are covered by His perfectness or righteousness or purity. So I think Maximus thinks that, okay, the highest motivation for good works is this love of God. But God accepts also those works that are not like perfectly motivated or are lacking, like fear of punishment. That's not like the highest form of obedience in any way. So I think the difference is there. But to make this more problematic, I think then this will be a history lesson. I think because then this. That if we take like Martin Luther from the early 1520s, he was very optimistic that if one has true faith, one will naturally do good works. So there is no need to preach law or like post these threats of punishment. But then in 1530s, like Lutherans go through this antinomian controversy when there are theologians who claim that no law should be preached to the Christians. And then the Lutherans thought that, okay, this is not correct, that the law must be preached to Christians as well. And then this controversy is reflected in Chemnitz, for example, when he says that we must. There is this idea that you must do good. If you don't, your faith is not living a true faith. So I wonder if that comes quite close to this kind of a fear, like obedience motivated by fear, which is present in Maximus. That if you won't do good just out of love for God as a response to divine grace, then you must hear this threats of punishment, which will motivate you to outward obedience at least. So I think there is kind of when we speak about justification, then it's this kind of the perspective I said earlier, that you need this perfection, and that is taken care by Christ. When we move to justification, to renewal, then this perspective of Maximus is perhaps more like is closer to Maximus, because then these impure motives are allowed.
Interesting. Yeah. So the impure motive of fear of divine punishment, what could seem to be an impure motive of fear of divine punishment, that's actually considered among the proper spiritual motives in Maximus, right? That's what you're saying, right? Like, that's part of. And yeah. So actually, what would be an impure motive? It's kind of like a social concern with being approved by other people. Is that right?
I think in the Lutheran tradition, it's often just that it's self-serving motive in some sense, that it's not motivated by pure love of God or pure altruism, but there's like you don't do something good in order to receive something yourself.
Okay, so in Lutheranism, right, they would
Yeah,
consider
yeah,
some of these proper motives in Maximus to
yeah,
actually be impure.
yeah,
But in Maximus, to achieve a proper spiritual motive is actually kind of easier than in Lutheranism because he would include fear of divine punishment as a proper spiritual motive.
yeah. The approach is
Whereas you're
more
saying
like,
the Lutheran,
yeah, it's got graded, or there's 3 levels in Maximus. But in Lutheranism, there's a tendency to just portray this picture that is either or. Either your works are like completely perfect or they are not. And if they are not, then God judges you
mm,
by his law, which demands perfection in the context of justification. Then we move to the sanctification or renewal, then it's a different story, or then these imperfections are. Then impure obedience is pleasing to God, but it's covered in righteousness of Christ. And then it's like theoretically, or in God's eyes, it's perfect. Although I shouldn't say in reality, but if we look at the motives of the Christian, then it's not like ideal.
right? And so just to be clear, for Maximus, then the impure motives, the motives that you know would be, um, if you observe, if you're observant in virtue of what you say are like hedonistic drives, actions aimed at pleasing people. I think in the paper, if that's why you're observant, um, that will not count toward your justification. Is that those would be the key impure spiritual motives for
Well,
Maximus?
Maximus doesn't use the term impure motivations, I don't think, and
Oh,
that's
okay,
not a
okay,
typical way of him for him to frame the issue. I think that's the
okay,
Lutheran
got you.
way. But
Oh, okay,
but
I
yeah,
understand. Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
So but in Maximus, I think there is this idea that there are levels of that these are like 3 levels of motivation. The highest level is this love of God, and the other two motives are somewhat self-serving, that you do something so that you avoid punishment or get a reward. And then there's the other side, of course, is that there is also works that do not please God. And in Maximus' thought, these works are those that are motivated often by hedonistic or sensual pleasures. So we do outwardly good stuff to have some pleasures to ourselves. And for him, this is the tendency of the fallen man. So we want to follow rules in order to get something earthly and sensual as a reward. So obedience to God is not motivated by getting to know Him better or to grow in virtues and godliness, but it's about this life and pleasures of this life.
Okay, and so that's this ascetical theology
Yep.
coming out really clearly. So you are not, following the law of grace. We distinguished those three laws before, and one of, is the law of grace. And so you're kind of outside the law of grace if you are observant in virtue of more hedonistic, sensual orientation. Um, okay, yeah. So great. Okay, so I mean, I guess maybe just to, I'm trying to be mindful of time here too. Like, if we just had to kind of summarize then Maximus's answer to the reference question, to what works do the works of law and Paul refer? What works of law are being excluded from your justification? If you just kind of had to summarize it quickly, like how would you do that?
Well, I think there's this kind of maybe broader definition and a stricter definition. So I think, broadly speaking, any work can be a work of the law if it is motivated if it's mere external observance of a commandment of God without this proper motivation. And practically speaking, it's I think in Maximus always some sort of the wrong motivation has something to do with the sensual pleasure, love of carnal pleasures. So I think the broadest definition would be that any work can be a work of the law if it's not properly motivated. But Maximus' works do contain some passages in which he clearly states that the ritual laws have been abrogated, so they do not apply to Christians. So this is, of course, the new perspective kind of a view. But I think he has this, and the first one is closer to the old perspective. So I think he can have these two views there. But I think it would be characteristic of Maximus to understand this abrogation of the ceremonial laws or ceremonial laws as just a group of laws like any other law, but the key question is how is the obedience of the one who tries to be obedient to the law, how is the one who tries to be obedient, how is he motivated?
Right.
So it's about
And
motivation.
so that's, and like you say in your paper, that insofar as any any work, any active observance of God's law can be included there for Maximus in a way that shows that he has he's a little bit closer to the old perspective than say the authors Matthew Thomas reviews in his book.
Yeah.
That's like one way in which he's maybe a bit closer. Not to say you're not necessarily saying he's closer overall to the old perspective. It's just that he's a bit closer to the old perspective in certain ways than the second century authors that Thomas reviews.
Yep.
Right. Great. So, what about? I think we've kind of touched on the purpose question. What is the purpose of the works of the law? We've kind of touched on that. For Maximus, that would really pertain to virtue building, right? Is that it would be have to do with his ascetical theology? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. So for Maximus, works are means of acquiring virtues, and so Maximus' approach to works in general is very positive, and he believes that, if I have understood correctly, I think like virtues in Maximus are a combination of human habitual practices and divine grace. And through virtues, we participate in divine attributes. And this is the inner righteousness, or this kind of I would say inner righteousness, inner participation in Christ. Christ becomes embodied in us when we participate in his true virtues. But of course, when we come to the question of the works of the law, then the focus is on the Judaizers, or those guys who against whom Paul writes. And in this context, works of the law are a negative thing, because these Judaizers sought to impose these works of the law to the Gentile believers. Maximus tends to present Jews in a very critical light, and he sees them as a prime example of fallen humanity, a group of people whose life is solely dedicated to a pursuit of sensual pleasures. And I think this view shapes his interpretation of the Jewish relationship to the Mosaic law. So he argues that the Jews understood the Mosaic law's punishments to refer only to temporal punishments, and rewards only to sensual rewards. And as a result, their obedience to the law was driven by the hope of earthly sensual pleasures. And then there is this one interesting passage where Maximus argues that some Jews claim that descendants from Jacob is a prerequisite for knowing God. And if we take this idea and apply it to Judaizers, then they could be conceived as a group of Jewish Christians who believe that one must be circumcised in order to be a child of Jacob and an heir of these various temporal promises that God promised to Israel in exchange for obedience to the Torah. So I think that if this interpretation is accurate, then I think this takes Maximus very close to the new perspective on Paul, because the works of the law relate to the Jewish people and Jewish identity. But what then differentiates Maximus? Like, what is the fundamental difference from all this other perspective, whether it's the old, new, or even the Thomas's early perspective on Paul, is this emphasis on ascetical theology, which frames his treatment of the whole question.
Yeah, just real quick, I found the this contrast of like two ages of the age associated with, I guess, the Old Testament of law having a sort of corporeal reign where obedience is kind of measured by this sensible corporeal compliance, and then this new age that Christ revealed, this age of spiritual fulfillment. I found it a little bit like I think there's something to it. I just thought, on the other hand, there are people like Jeremiah and Ezekiel who are worried about the heart. They're not just totally immersed in this mere corporeal observance, and obviously there's some psalms that connect to that too. Anyway, so I thought it was a little bit puzzling the way he was characterizing the Jews, but I don't know. Do you have any?
Well, I would think that he doesn't conceive Jeremiah and his prophets as Jews in this negative sense, in which he talks about the Jews. I think he would understand them as those who followed the law, like out of fear of God or in hope of reward. So, because there is this in Maximus, you have the story of this maturation of the people of Israel. So, and that's the reason why the written law focuses on this outward punishments is that God is like this God is a divine pedagogue who is like making sure that the children of Israel are growing well and mature, so that they receive the grace which comes in Christ. So I think the prophets would probably just be like preachers who preach according to the spiritual state of the people of Israel. At least, like if we think that there is the multitude of the Jews who are probably not that well motivated, but then you have the remnant or something like that, like these good guys who are more spiritually inclined. Maybe the prophets directed their message to those. Yeah, of course, this is speculation because Maximus doesn't treat this issue in detail, but I think this would be in harmony with his thought.
Okay, great. So, unfortunately, due to time, I think we won't be able to delve too much into the third question, which is really the question of like, why is it that the works of law are not necessary for Christians? Unfortunately, we won't be able to get into that, but I do recommend listeners to check out your article because it's really fascinating how you engage with that issue. But yeah, just to conclude. What do you think? Maybe do you just want to maybe just say a couple sentences about like this whole issue of like Maximus's alignment with the old perspective versus the new? Just some like basic takeaways for the listener when they think about Maximus vis-a-vis those two perspectives.
I think other questions of the works of the law, Maximus comes closer to the old perspective on Paul in that he argues that works of the law can refer to any work whatsoever if it's not properly motivated. I think then at the same time he agrees with the new perspective and the early perspective that Christians are not obliged to follow the Mosaic law, and that the Judaizers probably insisted on this point. Then regarding the purpose of the law, Maximus reflects the emphasis of the new perspective and the perspective in affirming that one does not have to become a Jew in order to belong to the covenant community. But his perspective is shaped above all by his ascetical theology. And this is, of course, absent from the other frameworks. Then, well, yeah, we didn't go to the third question, but I think there on the question of why we are not obliged to follow the works of the law, I think he comes very close to the new perspective and the early perspective. There's no indication that he was worried about any works righteousness, or that the Apostle Paul ruled out works from justification, because he was worried that the Christians try to merit eternal life by their good deeds. So this is a completely foreign idea to Maximus. And I think solely because of this reason, if I have to say that which camps Maximus belongs to, I think he belongs to the new perspective and early perspective camp, because that presupposition is so fundamental. The presupposition that Paul deals with works righteousness is so fundamental to the old perspective that if Maximus does not share that one, then he doesn't belong to that camp, at least.